TikTok. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. The algorithms there are just so good at pushing stuff that's wrong. Today I'm going to debunk a whole bunch of bad TikToks. It's mostly going to be skincare, and I've responded to some of these before on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube Shorts. But in shorter videos, I can only fit in a fraction of what I want to talk about before it's too long or complex and the algorithm just ignores it. So in this video, I'm going into more detail. Let's start with this video bashing CeraVe.
You use this. This contains propylparaben. Propylparaben is an estrogen-like compound that is under this class of what we call parabens. Women that are trying to get pregnant or breastfeeding are told to avoid parabens. This is because they're being researched to disrupt hormone function in a negative way. Parabens are in a lot of cosmetic products, and I would not want to rub these onto my skin, my body's largest organ. Especially as a man, when you introduce an estrogen-like compound that can disrupt your testosterone levels. So I don't use this. I think this is trash.
Watching this TikTok kind of made me feel like I was back in the early 2010s. Parabens were one of the first ingredient classes that got demonized by the natural beauty movement and then the clean beauty movement. All of this was sparked by a study in 2004, which found that parabens were in breast cancer tissue. The researcher is called propylparaben. She's done a lot of research that's gotten blown out of proportion. So there were a lot of issues with this study. First off, they only looked at breast cancer tissue. They didn't compare it with healthy tissue, so parabens are probably in those too. And even if you only found the parabens in the breast cancer tissue, it doesn't mean that parabens are causing cancer. It could be that cancer tissue happens to collect parabens more. It could be some other thing that's introducing parabens as well as some cancer-causing ingredient. It could be something completely unrelated because correlation isn't causation. On top of that, in this study, the blank samples that didn't actually have any tissue at all also had parabens. So really all this study showed is that parabens are used a lot, including in the detergents used to clean lab equipment. But this study got blown up. It was reported in newspapers, in forwarded emails, on Facebook, and so this idea that parabens are bad and they're related to breast cancer is just in everyone's minds, and it just keeps spreading. All of this paraben phobia stuff was around even before I started my blog back in 2011, so hi if you're new here. I'm Michelle of Lab Muffin Beauty Science, chemistry PhD, cosmetic chemist, and person who has been annoyed at misinformation on the internet for way too long. These days there are barely any products on the market that have parabens, and he just happened to pick up one of the ones that does. There's also a bunch of specific things he's saying that are worded very carefully, kind of weasel words, and I'm not sure he's even aware he's doing this. So he says, women that are trying to get pregnant or breastfeeding are told to avoid parabens. Who is telling them? Are they misinformed? Is it just you telling them? Sometimes apparently IVF clinics and endocrinologists who are doctors who specialize in hormones, they will say things like this, but they don't necessarily know much about things like parabens and skincare and their impact. They're often going off things they've come across on internet sources, just like, well, this guy. One of my friends is actually an endocrinologist, and I checked with her a couple of weeks ago. She has never been taught anything about endocrine disruptors in skincare. Parabens have been used for over 100 years. They're a super popular preservative that's in everything. That study was in 2004. There's been studies since, and it still hasn't made it onto the medical syllabus. And this is actually a good sign that parabens probably don't have that big of an impact. He also says this is because they're being researched to disrupt hormone function in a negative way. And yeah, this is clever. Who is researching this? Is it a scientist? Is it just you Googling? What were the findings of this research? This phrase is a bit like someone is being sued. Like, it is not that hard to sue someone. Being sued doesn't really mean much except someone either doesn't like you or thinks you have deep pockets. He says they're estrogen-like, but in what way? The estrogenic activity of parabens are generally thousands of times less strong than natural estrogen to begin with. So with propylparaben, in the EU there's a body called the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety, and they look at the safety of different cosmetic ingredients going into cosmetics in the EU. They actually reviewed all of the evidence on propylparaben in 2021 because they were going through a list of potential endocrine disruptors and looking at all of the data with fresh eyes. They concluded that propylparaben is safe when used in skincare products at the previously recommended concentrations. I have another video that breaks down how these evaluations work, and as part of this evaluation, they looked at what happened if you used the maximum concentration in 17 different products. And they found that you still get 12,500 times less than an amount that they would still consider safe. Whenever I talk about this ingredient safety stuff, I always get a lot of comments asking, don't the amounts add up if you use more than one product? I think People tend to forget that toxicologists, the ones who do these assessments, are also normal people with normal lives outside of their work. They go home and use products too. They have partners and kids who use multiple products. Like, this is not a revelation. This is something that is taken into account in the assessments. Now, in general, big brands like CeraVe, they make pretty much the safest products you can buy. I think a lot of people forget to do like a reality check when they accuse giant brands of trying to kill them. These big beauty companies hire tons of scientists. If it was this easy for someone who has zero science background to just pick up a product and look at the ingredient list and just tell that it's unsafe, they wouldn't have released this product. It would just not happen. This sort of stuff goes through approval by lots of different people, including lots of scientists. Liability is a thing. On top of that, dermatologists recommend CeraVe all the time. There's just no chance that so many of them are going around recommending something obviously harmful. Another thing that bothers me is that he goes on about how the skin is the body's largest organ, except he's holding a face cleanser, which is like, your face is about 4% of your body surface area. I guess it also depends how big your face is, but also skin's main function is to act as a barrier. It would be really bad if it just absorbs everything really efficiently just because it's big. It would probably be safer to rub something all over your skin, your entire giant body organ, compared to rubbing it on, like, I don't know, your pancreas or something, and it'd probably also be a lot safer to actually reach it. In my original response to this, I said that I really hate this genre of dudes who don't understand science lecturing people on science while holding products in supermarkets. A handful of people got really annoyed at me because reverse sexism or whatever, but if you've been on TikTok for long enough, you'll know that this is a thing. Whether it's a thing because more dudes film supermarket videos because, I don't know, they don't actually own skincare so they can't film at home, or maybe the algorithm is just picking up more dudes lecturing in supermarkets because people are more willing to trust it at face value when it's a man. These videos just blow up and show up in my feed all the time. Women obviously make BS TikToks that blow up too, but they're not this same genre. It usually seems to be like a woman in her bathroom or her bedroom and she's holding a product, or she's throwing out products and she's getting really upset. Sometimes there's like tears in her eyes, sometimes her voice is really shaky. And she's going on about how there's all these chemicals that she's never heard of in her products and what are they doing to us? Why are they trying to kill us? Social media algorithms respond to signals from people and people have biases. There's plenty of research that people tend to believe technical information when it comes from a man over when it comes from a woman, and that people accept emotional things like crying more from a woman than from a man. We live in a society, even if you think you're 100% objective and rational and not sexist, there are tons of people out there who are, so deal with it.
Have you seen the ingredients?
Oh god, it's Bobby. Alright, so Bobby is a home cook who makes videos about what you mostly should and shouldn't eat, and he recently started on personal care products. There's this trend of people who used to make food content starting to talk about how toxic personal care products are, and I think this is because apps that usually look at food, like the EWG apps and Yuka, they also have a personal care section. It's just really easy to make scary content that goes viral using these apps because you just scan the product and you just read out what comes up on your phone. Bobby is like a menace. Scientists and doctors are constantly debunking his food content, so let's see what he has to say.
Personal care products, they're scary.
Are they, Bobby? Are they? Or do you just not know these words?
Anytime you see the word paraben, put it back, especially propylparaben. These are preservatives that prevent mold from growing in here, but they're hormone disruptors, endocrine disruptors. They mimic estrogen in your body. And for the ladies out there, they find more of that in your body because it's in your lotions, potions, and makeup.
Alright, so it's parabens again, and the source he's using here is the EWG's Skin Deep database. The EWG is not a scientific source, and honestly, any app that judges the safety of products just based on the ingredients list, which has no information on concentration, is pseudoscience. The amount is really important in safety because the more molecules of something that you're exposed to, the more chances it has to interact with whatever part of the body it has to interact with to cause harm. That's why you might have heard the phrase, the dose makes the poison, a lot from toxicologists. The EWG specifically has this really long history of capitalizing on fear. So for example, they used to promote the idea that vaccines cause autism. That whole thing was based off a study that was mostly just what did parents remember. The stuff online that explains why the EWG is bad is mostly about how they approach food safety, but they use the same sort of principles for evaluating cosmetics. So there was this survey done by the Society of Toxicology, and they asked 937 members what they thought about particular ideas. 92% of their respondents disagreed that any level of exposure is unacceptable for chemicals that have been identified as carcinogens, mutagens, or reproductive toxicants. That is pretty much the methodology that the EWG uses. If it's in there, it's bad. They also had 81% rejecting the notion that the detection of any level of a chemical in your body indicates a significant health risk. And yeah, this is exactly what the EWG does in their summaries. There's also this article that looked at the EWG's Dirty Dozen list, which looks at what foods tend to have the most pesticide residues. And there's some really good quotes here, but I think the best one is probably, the methodology used to create the Dirty Dozen list does not appear to follow any established scientific procedures, and that is pretty much the same for the Skin Deep database.
Pick up almost any product here. Fragrance. Shaving cream with fragrance and body wash with parfum or fragrance. That's the key word. If you see that, put it back, because that's the cosmetics version of natural flavors. But there can be up to 3,000 synthetic fragrances or perfumes in there. They're proprietary. They ain't got to tell you anything, and they're linked to reproductive issues, and they find these fragrances in breast milk. It's scary stuff. You don't want it.
So yeah, finding stuff in your body is not a sign that it's scary. There is a lot of stuff online about how they don't tell you all the individual components of fragrances, and therefore it's scary. So there's a pretty obvious reason they don't tell you, because fragrances are trade secrets, just like flavors, just like the Coca-Cola recipe. There's all this consumer research showing that the first thing people do when they try a product is they smell it. Smell is associated with a lot of memories and strong emotional responses, and that's why it is in everything, and it's so secretive. It's a large part of what makes people buy products. For fragrance, there's an organization called IFRA, which is the International Fragrance Association. It's for fragrance producers, and they have rules that their members have to follow. I'll link the website below. It tells you a lot about them, like they produce 80% of the global volume of fragrance. Their rules are based on safety assessments by the Research Institute of Fragrance Materials, or RIFM. These are scientists who look at fragrance safety, and they publish their safety assessments in a peer-reviewed journal. There's also a separate independent panel that reviews what they do, including how they design their experiments. These IFRA standards are really widely recognized in the industry and by governments and regulators as well. For example, if you're registering a cosmetic product in the EU, you can use an IFRA compliance certificate as part of your safety dossier. There are even regulations in some countries that specifically refer to the IFRA standards. So basically, if you're buying a product that's from a reputable brand, it should comply with the IFRA standards, and you can probably ask them. Alright, so let's say Bobby isn't happy with that. He wants to see the full ingredient list. What is he going to do with it? I mean, I wouldn't know what to do with it. Again, there are no concentrations on this thing. If there are concentrations, then I would probably take it to a toxicologist who knows stuff about cosmetics. They would probably just tell me to check those concentrations against what IFRA recommends, because they're the people who know the most about this and do all the research. So you would just end up at the same place. He also goes on about how it could have synthetics, and this happens a lot when it comes to cosmetic fear-mongering. We humans have this bias towards assuming that natural things are just safer and better. It's called appeal to nature. But if you think about it for a bit, it's obviously just not true. Nature is constantly trying to kill us. I am from Australia. I know this very well. The most toxic substances known are actually natural. Even the most toxic one, it can be safely used. It is Botox. And this whole natural bias thing is especially silly for fragrance, because it is really well established that natural fragrances are full of allergens, which is one of the things he lists here. There are a bunch of allergens you have to list out in your ingredients list in certain regions like the EU and Australia, and most of these are things you find in essential oil, things like linalool and geraniol. Maybe he doesn't know this because he's in the US, and yes, I do think this is something that the US should start doing. And with this EWG entry, they're generalizing 3,000 different chemicals here. All of these effects that they've got, they probably come from a small handful of these 3,000. They might not even be in your fragrance. If they are, and you're buying from a responsible brand, then they're going to be at an amount that the evidence indicates is safe. Plus, a lot of essential oils have these effects as well. Same as for fragrance, these effects just don't happen at the small amounts used. If the maker is being responsible. One thing I do sometimes worry about is that some natural brands do use essential oils, and there are limits on essential oils set by IFRA as well. These brands who are just dumping essential oils in, assuming that they are safe, they could be putting in way too much. So realistically, that is going to be a much bigger problem than fragrances put in things by big brands. And yes, you can avoid all fragrance things if you want, just in case, but it does mean that you're probably unnecessarily restricting yourself. So we went on about finding stuff in breast milk. Again, having something in there doesn't mean that much. Scientists have gotten really good at measuring tiny amounts of stuff.
How do you think they get this blue color in the body wash? Well, it's with blue 1 and red 33, artificial coloring, but those are almost always derived from tar or petroleum loaded with toxins, and many of these colorants are banned in other countries, but not here.
This is really silly, more than usual. Just because something comes from something scary doesn't mean it's loaded with toxins. When they're making it, they get rid of these toxins. I mean, he's just been groping all these plastic bottles, which are also made from petroleum. Plus, the US is actually really strict with colorants. They're stricter than pretty much anywhere else. So the FDA in the US actually certifies each batch of colorants, and this is from their website. The FDA determines the need for batch certification based on whether the color additives needs this level of control to protect public health. Some color additives in their uncertified forms might contain impurities at levels that pose a health concern, and colors subject to certification are typically synthetic, made from raw materials obtained from petroleum. So literally, the FDA is really strict about these supposed toxins that he's worried about. So someone from the FDA will actually analyze the sample. They'll look at lots of things including purity, and they're specifically saying they look for unreactive intermediates, colored impurities, residual salts, any other unspecified impurities including heavy metals. If the sample doesn't meet these requirements, they reject the batch, and the FDA certifies color additives before they're used in products. So it's illegal to use colors that aren't certified, and yeah, this is a really high level of control, higher than these other countries he's talking about.
pH balanced for a woman, but strong enough for a man, but also with talc. You don't want talc because talc and asbestos go hand in hand, which is why baby powder isn't made with talc anymore, because you can't get rid of the asbestos. You gotta put it back, even though it's pH balanced for me and you.
Ah, Bobby. It's so dramatic. I've talked about talc and asbestos before, I'll link the video down below, but basically from the evidence so far, it is not that big of a problem as it's made out to be. You can actually see here the EWG only rates it as a 5, which I'm actually kind of surprised by. It could be that there are a lot of organic brands who use it. There have been instances in the past where the EWG will just jiggle their ratings, allegedly, for their partners. Their partners pay a fee to be listed nicely in their database. Allegedly. One thing I will say for Bobby is that his shirts are great.
The cosmetics industry is not regulated nearly as much as the food industry, which is really scary because this stuff goes on your body. So the question is, what's the best sunscreen as the summer comes upon us?
First off, stuff that goes on your body is generally less scary than stuff that goes in your body because, yeah, your skin does act as a barrier. Sunscreen is a drug, not a cosmetic in the US, which is where he is, so he's talking about entirely the wrong category here.
Well, there's two kinds of sunscreen. There's mineral-based, the good ones, and chemical-based, the bad ones. Minerals are often made of zinc oxide, and that's good because it never penetrates your skin. The chemical-based ones are made with chemicals that penetrate your skin and can be found in your body, in your breast tissue, in baby milk, breast milk, up to 3 or 4 weeks later.
So minerals can penetrate your skin, especially if they have small enough particles. That's actually why a lot of places have a different safety assessment specifically for nanoparticles. I feel like I could just post myself saying this to TikTok every week, but the amount with normal use doesn't seem to be a big health risk, because that is the basis for all of these safety assessments. And that is pretty much the same situation for chemical sunscreens, although obviously for different substances, it will be different percentages. You have a huge range within chemical sunscreens as well, because a lot of the newer ingredients were specifically designed to not get through skin easily. There were these studies on sunscreens done by the FDA a while ago, which was all publicized as sunscreens get all the way into your blood. This is not new information, but the nice thing about the FDA studies is that they said how much actually gets in there. If you do a bunch of rough calculations, you'll see that only a fraction of a percent of most of these chemical sunscreens get absorbed. Also, if you're wondering, the safety assessments do take into account developing fetuses. Usually that is the endpoint that they're based on. I talk about that in my EU sunscreen video. So this whole good ingredient, bad ingredient thing really makes me cringe because it is just such a big red flag. Good and bad depends entirely on dose. And specifically in sunscreens, zinc oxide does have tons of downsides, which I've talked about before. The main one is that it is not very good as a sunscreen. You need lots of it to absorb a relatively small amount of UV. People also underapply it because it's got a white cast and it usually has a thick, sticky texture. It's also not that great for the environment, despite what everyone seems to be assuming. I'll probably make a video on that later too.
When you pick up a chemical-based one, you're always going to see the same active ingredients. Avobenzone, homosalate, aptizolate. These are the kind of chemicals you want to avoid. And if you're ever thinking about using any kind of spray bottle like this, avoid it, because when it goes into the air, it can be inhaled into your lungs and coat the inside of your body. If you want to see a video about the best mineral-based sunscreens, let me know and I'll make a part 2 of the video.
This is so weird. Like, he says coat the inside of your body like you don't have stuff inside your body. With spray sunscreens, I personally don't really like them because there are a lot of downsides. The point that he made about how you could inhale it is actually a good point. The health risk from inhaling sunscreen is generally quite low. It's taken into account in the safety assessments, but the risk is higher for mineral sunscreens. But I think it's still not a very nice experience to breathe it all in, and you end up with lower protection because your insides do not need protection from the sun. Alright, that is enough Bobby for me today. He mostly makes food content, so if you want to see people debunking that, I highly recommend Food Science Babe. She is a legend. I'm pretty sure her eye rolling muscles must be super buff because that has made me tired.
Our next estrogenic is sunscreens. I don't know of any sunscreen with a chemical UV filter in it that doesn't have some affinity for hormonal receptors in the human body. Some of the common ones are benzophenone 3 or BP3, benzylidine camphor 3BC, 4-methylbenzylidine camphor or 4-MBC, but there are dozens of them. Watch out for the root benz or fen in the chemical name. Better yet, just don't use a chemical-based sunscreen.
Alright, this one is a bit more complicated because he does talk about a lot of technical stuff. He's a pharmacist and he mostly runs a business advising people on how to fix their hormones. My PhD is in medicinal chemistry. I also did pharmacology in undergrad, so receptors are like one of my things, you know, my buddy old pals. So he says sunscreens all have affinity for hormone receptors, and yeah, that is probably true and not that surprising because lots of substances will bind to receptors in our bodies, but the issue is that alone just doesn't tell you very much. So first off, binding, which just means the sunscreen molecule comes along and sticks to a hormone receptor inside your body. That doesn't just mean a negative effect, because how well something binds, how sticky it is, that doesn't necessarily have a good relationship with what it actually does there. Obviously it has to stick to do something, but what it does, there is a huge range. Things that bind to the same receptor can have completely opposite effects or even no effect. One more common example is with opioid receptors, which is where opioids like fentanyl and heroin will act. Both of those will have affinity for the receptor, so in other words, they will stick to it, but they also have efficacy, which means they will actually trigger some sort of effect there. You might have heard of Narcan or naloxone, which is used to treat opioid overdoses, and the way that works is also by binding to the same receptors, but actually they have more affinity, they stick more strongly. But it doesn't actually trigger anything there, so it's got really, really low or no efficacy. So it essentially kicks out the heroin or fentanyl or whatever the person's overdosing on. It's a bit like a key and a lock, so both heroin and fentanyl can open this particular lock, but naloxone is sort of like a key that fits in the lock, but it doesn't open the door and it actually gets stuck there. And so it blocks keys that will actually do something. And on top of that, binding affinity is about what happens when your sunscreen and the receptor actually meet. But the substance actually has to get to the receptor in a high enough concentration first. And where that receptor is in your body can mean that binding there will trigger different effects. So this all sounds really scary because it's unfamiliar and technical, but it doesn't really mean much. Sunscreens still need to be assessed for safety on a case-by-case basis. And that is actually what happens for sunscreens to get approved, and that goes for both chemical sunscreens and physical sunscreens.
Chemical sunscreens are lipophilic, meaning they're attracted to fat, and we all have a fatty layer in our skin, so a lot of it absorbs right in. It doesn't just stay on the surface. Remember, the skin's an effective dosing route for hormones and drugs applied as creams. So yes, it acts as a barrier and protection from exposures to lots of different things, but to substances with the right properties, your skin skin is like a wide open, unguarded back door, and what goes in through the skin dumps right into the bloodstream without being metabolized at all by the liver, like food and other things we eat, which go to the liver first and then into the circulation. It's like getting these chemicals by injection. Yikes.
So here is another bunch of arguments that aren't quite right, but they do have some grain of truth, and they sound complicated and scary enough that people aren't going to question him. So let's break down all of this stuff. First off, sunscreens are lipophilic. That means they're oil-loving. The thing is though, things that are too lipophilic, they don't actually get through skin easily. He makes it sound like the fatty layer under the dermis, which is the hypodermis. It's like there somewhere. He makes it sound like that is like a magnet that just sucks lipophilic things like chemical sunscreens through the skin. But the way that lipophilic oil-loving things stick to fat or oil is through forces called dispersion forces, and these are really short range. They don't act like a magnet, they can't suck things through the skin. Essentially, the chemical sunscreen has to bump into the fat or oil before it sticks. Like, I think we all know that if you rub coconut oil or just like a greasy sunscreen on your skin, it doesn't all get sucked through. You can't feed yourself by rubbing coconut oil on. He is correct though that some substances can get through skin really easily if they have the right properties, but that is not many things, and that is not chemical sunscreens. There are a lot of medications that are meant to get into the bloodstream and spread that way, but so few of them are delivered as creams. If injections and creams did the same thing, we just would never inject things. Injections are so much more annoying and painful. If we could get them through easily without injections, then yeah, that would be amazing. So things that do go through skin easily, they actually have to have the right balance of lipophilic and hydrophilic. Things that are very lipophilic, like he says, they don't get through easily. Skin has both water and oil. So you can see on my handy skin model, we have the blood here, and to get to the blood, stuff has to go through a bunch of different layers. And these layers are complex. There are oily layers. The top layer, for example, is oily. That's the stratum corneum. It has that brick and mortar structure, and the mortar between the bricks is very oily. And then you also have more watery areas as well as you go down. So if a particular chemical is too lipophilic, it likes oil too much, or it's too hydrophilic, it likes water too much, it gets stuck on its way to the bloodstream. Chemical sunscreens are quite lipophilic, so most of them actually get stuck in this top layer of the stratum corneum. That's actually how chemical sunscreens sink in a bit, and they last for longer than physical sunscreens. So to get into the blood, it's not just about being lipophilic, it's got to be the right balance of not too lipophilic, not too hydrophilic. And we do have data on how much chemical sunscreens absorb into blood, and for most of these, it is a fraction of a percent, like I said before. Working out how much of a chemical is likely to absorb into blood is part of that toxicological assessment that's done for sunscreens. He also didn't seem to realize that the SCCS has gone through the data on benzophenone 3, which is oxybenzone, as well as 4-MBC. I mentioned before that they were only looking at potential endocrine disruptors, and only a few sunscreens actually made it to the list, so only a handful of chemical sunscreens have enough evidence that it's worth reassessing. For the ones they have assessed, they found that there isn't enough evidence to say any of them are endocrine disruptors, except perhaps 4-MBC. Check out my video for more on that. So the reason that they've ended up at a different conclusion from him is that he is just looking at studies and taking them at face value. He's assuming what happens in the study is exactly the same as what happens when we apply sunscreen on our skin. But studies in the literature generally aren't done under realistic conditions, so a lot of the time it's animal and cell line studies, which they're obviously not the same as humans. Even with human studies, they usually use really artificial conditions like using way too much sunscreen. In the proper assessments, like the ones done by the SCCS, they translate the studies so that they're actually relevant to how normal people use sunscreens. And that's how they come up with the guidelines that formulators follow when they're making the sunscreens. It is all based on the same evidence. It's just that toxicologists are interpreting the studies in a nuanced and scientific way, whereas other people are just not actually doing interpretation.
You may say, well, I don't often use sunscreen, so this really isn't an issue for me. But remember, it's in cosmetics too, like makeup, skin creams, even some soaps. So daily application is a likelihood for a lot of people. Now, chemical UV filters are required to be listed as an ingredient in cosmetic products, but protecting human skin is not their only use. They also protect other materials from the harmful effects of UV light, like plastics, carpet, furniture.
And all of this is taken into account in toxicological assessments. It really drives me up the wall when people say, but it adds up like it's some sort of huge revelation. It is not a huge revelation. It is really obvious. Everyone from the age of, 20 maximum onwards, we know that we use more than one product. Toxicologists do this every day as part of their jobs. They would have thought of this. I've been thinking about this for a pretty long time and I'm probably going to do a video on it. It is actually quite depressing and disturbing how much misinformation is spreading and how social media algorithms are really boosting it. It is just so much faster to scan ingredients with some BS app and make a TikTok about how scared you should be than to actually work out the reality of what's going on and figure out how to explain it in a way that people can understand. There are also just so many more people who can make this easy misinformation than people who have the knowledge to debunk all of their claims. So there's just more BS content to begin with, and then there's the social media algorithm part. If you know anything about social media marketing, you'll know that these algorithms generally reward 1, capturing people's attention in a really short time span, and 2, engagement. It is so much faster to explain some simplified BS concept than complex, messy science. And this sort of fear-mongering is such an engagement magnet because we're humans, we care about other people. If we find out that something common is dangerous, we're going to share it with people we care about. We are mostly good people. So these sorts of videos just get pushed by algorithms as everyone shares it and tags it, and it is just this massive compounding effect. So knowing this, I think there are some things that we can do to fight it. First off, be careful before sharing videos. If it's something scary, that is a massive red flag. If it talks about babies or pregnancy or cancer. If it's someone unqualified, it's also a red flag. And yes, sometimes unqualified people can share scary things that are true, but these are just signs that you should switch on your critical thinking. I think it's also good to do a reality check. Large companies have hundreds, thousands of scientists. If some unqualified person can quickly work out that they're all making toxic products, there's like zero chance that all of these scientists have missed it or that they're all covering it up. Big conspiracies involving hundreds of people just do not work because people do not keep their mouths shut. If you want to work out what's actually true, my advice is to look for the consensus of relevant experts. You want to check with experts from multiple relevant fields, see what they mostly seem to be saying, and that is likely going to be true, or at least it won't hurt you. Sometimes it can be hard to work out who the relevant experts are and which expert would know more. So for example, if you remember the benzene in sunscreen thing, when that first came out, journalists seemed to assume that dermatologists know tons about benzene for some reason, but clearly most dermatologists haven't even seen benzene in their life. The most relevant experts are toxicologists, and they were saying something completely different from dermatologists. And even within toxicology, it is a really diverse field. So a toxicologist who does academic research on frogs in the US might not know anything about cosmetics in the EU. And there are malicious experts out there who can be paid off, and also just incompetent people in every field. And that's why the consensus part is important. If a bunch of relevant experts overwhelmingly say the same thing, it is probably what's going to be true based on the current evidence. I hope that's useful. I'm sorry to be such a Debbie Downer, but this stuff is like a flood. Tag me on TikTok and Instagram if you see any posts that need debunking, and of course follow me on there. If you enjoyed this video, click the like and the subscribe to teach the algorithm that this is what you like seeing. Leave any myths you want me to debunk in the comments. I'll see you next time, and until then, don't film supermarket lectures.